stage. Let's lift the roof on the stadium for Even Zhang.
Thank you, Tanya. Before we get started, can you raise your hand if you are familiar or are currently using microservices? Cool, that's a lot of hands. Really awesome. As what I expect from the latency crowd. Can you keep your hands up if you're also using micro-frontends? Ooh, pretty cool. We've got a few hands. Definitely fewer than the microservices. Looks like I've got the right topic. So, exactly a year ago, I was speaking to a team of developers who has been working on a scaling web application. Both the application usage has been scaling, but they've also been scaling their development team. And they've migrated from a monolithic architecture to a microservices architecture. Very successful, very smooth. They absolutely loved it. They were like, our velocity has increased by fold. We're loving it. But there was one problem. We were still bottlenecked by one component, and that's their front end. Their massive React code base was the bottleneck, the blocker to all their feature releases. So despite breaking up all their backend services into their specific domains, into their specific teams, giving ownership and autonomy to each and individual team over their backend, they still had to coordinate and orchestrate with other teams for their front-end releases. And that's where it brings us today, where I'm going to talk about and take you on a journey on how we can break up the front-end monolith and truly bring autonomy to your teams, to the domains, so they can fully own the end-to-end of their services. So to start with, what are micro-frontends? If you Google micro-frontends today, you're going to find heaps of different definitions. But there's one definition that I particularly like, and that is as follows. It is an architectural style where independently deployable micro-frontends composes a single client application. And the keywords in here for me is they're independently deployable. And there's going to be people who tell you differently. But I'm going to tell you here, this is the right way. It needs to be independently deployable. If it's not independently deployable, that is not micro-frontends. You're probably just building components and webs. Build-time integration is not micro-frontends. But if those are too many words for you, this might be a little bit easier. It's microservices, but for front ends. To take a step further back and see how we've gotten to this point of micro front ends and really understand what is the advantage of front ends, we need to start right from the beginning, back in the BC times, the before cloud, where everybody had one single monolith. We realized that there's limits to the monolith. We've kind of moved away from it. We've moved into a three-tier application with front ends and back ends. We've separated people so the devs can talk less to each other, but they're still talking a lot to each other, which is a problem. So we further split them up and said, let's do microservices. Let's get especially the back-end engineers. They're probably the least sociable people. We've got to separate them as much as possible. And that's kind of worked out well. But then we realized we had a problem. They still had to talk to the front-end people. And all the front-end peoples are not split up. They're not very happy. And as you're scaling your application, your team also scales. The more people, the more communication, less work gets done. And that's where it brings us to the final form of evolution, micro front ends, where your team gets to own the front end and the back end and everything in between by yourself. You no longer have to talk to anyone. You can deploy independently with confidence that you're not going to break anyone else's code, hopefully. So hopefully that kind of illustrates what the advantages of micro front ends are. But if not, here's a list of more advantages on why you should really start using micro front ends. And you're going to see a lot of similarities to microservices, because it is really just microservices front ends. Number one, it's framework agnostic. We love choices in tech, and micro front ends gives you that choice. You can use React, Vue, or any other front ends you want, even if it's not web, because micro-frontends is really an architectural design rather than tied to a specific technology. This means you can actually use your Angular 1 apps with your React if you really wanted to. It also reduces code-based complexity per domain. If you're like me, big code bases scares me. Legacy code scares me because I didn't write it. I like simplistic code. I like to deal with a specific domain, specific problem. I like to be able to jump into a problem and understand it really quickly. In a monolithic code base, if anyone's worked in a front-end monolithic code base, you know how things get complicated. Especially if, for example, if you're working in React, let's hope it's using hooks, but most likely if you're working in a legacy code base, it will have super old things like mounts, unmounts, classes, Redux, and then hooks. And also and a million different other state management. And all you want to do is update a button. But you first need to understand everything else before you can update that button. So with micro front ends, you no longer have to do that. You can choose to just use hooks or use Redux. Although they live in the same single application, you can pick on what you want to work on. And it makes it super easy to onboard new developers, allowing more flexibility in your organization as well. It's also helpful for removing repetitive work. With micro front ends, you're able to share the things that you want to share. For example, sharing the authentication mechanism, sharing the login mechanism, sharing the data analytics mechanism. So each of the teams can really focus on working on their specific domain, solving their domain problems. And as an AWS employee, I have to mention this word, we call this undifferentiated heavy lifting. You really want your teams to be focused on delivering value. And delivering auth models, auth services a million times is not valuable. You want them to really focus on delivering the business value and keep it simple into their specific domains. Some other interesting things with micro frontends is you can also do A/B testing per micro frontend. For anyone who's done A/B testing on frontends, you know that you have to apply the A/B testing right at the beginning of the entry, and it will affect basically every page or the whole application. But with micro frontends, each team can choose when and how they do their A/B testing without affecting another team. It also encourages ownership and autonomy. It allows each team to own end-to-end. As the diagram that I've shown previously, you really don't have to talk to anyone anymore. You can own your code from back-end to front-end. But ultimately, it's to improve feature release velocity. Because you no longer have other blockers outside of your team, outside of your domain, to stop you from delivering a feature that's valuable. Stops you, you no longer have to be worried about stepping on other people's toes. You can now confidently release at the cycle that's suitable to your team. Cool. So we've looked at a lot of advantages. I'm hoping that everybody's super excited about micro frontends right now. Let's take a look at how it gets implemented. I'm going to be focused a little bit more on web applications, but the same concept also applies to client devices. In fact, a lot of client device front ends are built using micro front ends. The concept starts as follows. Usually start with what we call an application shell, or some might call it the host front end, or some might even call it a container to make things a little bit more confusing. And then you have other front ends, which is what we call the micro front ends. And the application shell will become the composer to host all the different micro front ends. In the following example, you can take a look at an application shell hosting two micro front ends, micro front end A and micro front end B. In a standard web applications, this might look like this. Is it readable? Good. It's not readable on my side. It might look like having a navigation bar and a page content, where navigation bar is a micro front end that's owned by a specific team. They own the deployment, they own the updates, whereas the page content, which is a separate domain to the navigation bar, can be owned by that specific team. So a change on a navigation bar does not have to affect the page content and vice versa. And here's an example for an e-commerce website. at how a micro front end would look there. We can have a shared navigation bar, and then we can have a home page that's managed by a team, and then we can have a shopping cart that's also managed by a separate team. And these teams can independently deploy without having to consult or orchestrate with another team. So how does composition occur with micro front ends? There's actually quite a few options, and I'm going to go through a few and talk about the pros and cons and some of the technologies involved in those composition. The most basic composition is probably server-side composition. So a browser hits a server would go and compose HTML, very traditional. For people who never thought about micro front ends, 10 years ago, this is probably what they were doing anyway, grabbing some HTML files, putting it into a template, and then loading it. That is, in fact, micro front ends. It is commonly used, especially for multi-device services. However, it does introduce quite a lot of complexity, and there's a lot of mature tooling in there, but most customers I've seen have been using custom tooling in composing some of these front ends. However, it does give you a lot of flexibility. For example, you could say, OK, if someone's coming from a mobile device, I can give it a specific front end. If someone's coming from a different device, like a PS5, I can give it a different front end. Or if they're coming from a different country, different combinations, you could do very, very complex logic in how you want to deliver those micro front ends. In contrary to server-side composition, my personal preference, and what I recommend to everybody here, is client-side composition. It's much easier, it's lightweight, and it's also serverless. You don't have to run any servers to compose this, and the technology is here with us today. Everything is composed and rendered at the front end. So when a user uses their browser, they will dynamically load the JavaScript files or HTML files from specifically separately hosted front ends into a single front end. So this means you could build a micro front end without servers, just using static web apps. So server-side and client-side are the two major composition methods that you could choose to use. If you've never done micro front ends, I would recommend starting with client-side. And if there's a need, go to server-side as needed. But recently, there's also been a new group of composition called edge composition, which is using edge functions to compose your front end. But in reality, most mature organizations actually use a combination of all three of these methods. However, ultimately, I would still recommend client-side composition because it's easy. So diving a little bit deeper into some of the technologies used for micro front ends. Because we're in 2023, the technology is finally here for us to do micro front ends. And I would like to introduce everybody to iframes. If you're not familiar with iframes, they're basically the Docker containers for web. Not only does it come with all the goodness of containers, letting you to run your web app anywhere you want, it will also come with all the security loopholes that you miss. That being said, iframes is definitely one solution that you can use to compose micro front ends. It may not be the prettiest. You may feel a little bit dirty using it, but it still works. But no, I don't recommend it. The other option that you have is a library called single SPA. It is a JavaScript router built specifically for micro front ends, allowing you to load dynamically different types of micro front ends into your application host. It is also one of the first technology I've seen that's dedicated to micro front ends, which has been growing in a lot of popularity recently. And single SPA is quite useful, I guess, a few years ago where other technologies didn't exist. But recently, we've got something that's a little bit easier. I wouldn't say it's necessarily better, but it's definitely an easier starting point. And that's module federation with Webpack. And I think Vite also copied it recently, which is good. Module federation allows you to load, again, similar to single SPA, allows you to load JavaScript files dynamically in runtime within the browser. And when used in combination with web components, you can run frameworks in frameworks. which allows a huge possibility of running, if you have different teams that uses different frameworks, such as a single team uses Vue, another team uses React, now they can coexist together without, forgot the word. Anyways, you could use a lot of frameworks with other frameworks. Frameworks in frameworks. But would I recommend that? Probably not. But if you do have a massive team, distributed team that uses different types of frameworks, I would recommend using module federations with web components. You can do something really, really fancy. But not as fancy as iframes, though. Oops. Here's some sample use cases, especially for those who are not using micro-frontends today. You may think, actually, my team's been working really well. We have a beautiful front-end team. I love talking to them. We don't really need micro-frontends. Have you thought about internal tooling? How many people here have built internal tools again and again with the same systems? We need auth, we need security, we need backends, we need analytics. If you've done that again and again for multiple tools, have you thought about an internal tools super app platform where an application host would do all the authentication, would do all the analytics, would do all the necessary artificial heavy lifting for your internal tools, while leaving a position for your micro front-end app as an internal tool? I've seen this super successful with some of the teams I've worked with, which allowed people from going from developing, spending months on an internal tool to days, because they don't have to worry about all the different complexity to do with the internal tooling, which is usually nothing to do with the actual tool. It's also super useful for migrating and upgrading legacy applications. This allows us to have incremental upgrades. Remember how I talked about you could use different frameworks? If you have an old PHP application, and I'm sure some of us do, and you want to upgrade it to the latest and greatest, how are you going to do that? Micro frontends will allow you to basically compose it as a micro frontend and load in necessary packages, necessary new components of micro frontends, and allow you to have an incremental upgrade so that you won't have to disturb any of your existing users. It's also super useful for anyone who's upgrading major framework versions. If you're on Angular 1 and you want to move to Angular 2, or you want to move to React, Vue, you can also use micro frontends so that all these frameworks can coexist at one point while you're slowly migrating off each component. It will also allow each component to basically exist in their own container, per se, so that they don't interfere with each other as much. Finally, this is a very interesting use case that I've worked with quite a few teams on, is combining multiple products into a single product. I've seen a lot of companies and organizations have now noticed that they don't need to have 70 different web apps. They just need one. But all the other apps will coexist in one app, and they only have to basically let their users log into one single app and get access to all their features. Through micro front ends, you can now combine, you could treat all your separate apps as a specific micro front end and then move them into one massive application. Not only does this make it easier as from a user experience point of view, because now they only have to access one product, it also makes it easier for people who are developing, because now they don't have to build as much repetitive and duplicate dev work across all those products. I try to finish a little bit earlier so we can have some Q&A. I know I have 6 minutes left, so.
If you've got a question, put up your hand and I can run the microphone out to you. Thank you, Matthew. Is this, thank you, it is.
Thanks, Evan, that's a good talk. I know you said you specifically weren't going to talk about it, but maybe you can talk about it briefly. What are the options that you have available for doing micro front ends on like native applications? I'm talking specifically about like an iOS application where you won't have that. You said it's a key thing, having them being independently deployable. We'd actually have probably like a build time complete. Like, what are the options that I can use on sort of an iOS application, for example?
I think for mobile applications, especially iOS applications, is quite unique to other because you can't unlike the web, you're not going to be able to deploy and see it straight away. But I still think there's a lot of benefit, especially, I guess it depends if you're on like using Swift or using WebView. If you're using like React Native with WebView and things, you can probably do something similar to websites. But if you're using Swift, then you probably you still have to do like, wait for the build time. But I think it still gives all the teams the autonomy to be able to deploy parts, especially if you also share a front end with the web. So I don't think it's completely, I still think there's a lot of value in it, but definitely not as much value as a website.
With microservices, one of the benefits is obviously the splitting of teams. And the nice thing is you kind of own everything, you can ship it out. With the micro front end, we introduce the notion of a shell. Who owns that? Who runs it? When it breaks, whose bum do I kick?
I think that depends. I think even with microservices, there's always some team that owns something that's cross services, and one of those teams might own the shell, but the shell should be really, really lightweight. So this should mean like minimize the dependency. It's not going to be perfect, but yeah, they might just be the front end team, the original front end team that was running the whole front end might become the application shell team. I think that's. But you could probably reduce that team size and move a lot of those front-end developers into specific teams so they work closely with the back-end, but that's probably the team that you want to annoy.
All right, thank you. Can you pass that back?
Thank you. Any general recommendations for code repository, as in like a monorepo versus micro front ends in separate repositories? And the second question is general guidelines to standardize the presentation of the micro front end, as in like a CSS or styling guides, stuff like that.
First question, I think it's completely up to preference. I'm a massive monorepo guy, but that's only if like if your tooling allows it. Not every single CI/CD tooling works with monorepo. But if you do have a CI/CD tool that works with monorepo, I don't see any issues with using micro front ends with monorepos. Second question with CSS, that's quite an interesting question. There's a notion with micro front ends is you get to choose what you share, what you don't share, and you can actually share. And one of the advantages in micro front ends is you can actually have a global CSS style that just applies to everything underneath, so everything looks consistent, and the people who are developing apps actually don't have to care about it. But you do have a notion where you could provide a shadow DOM, which you can control all the CSS you want, so that if you do need something that's a little bit different, you still can do that. So that's completely up to options to the actual teams, which I think is a great thing about micro front ends because you get to choose that based on your needs.
Go on over here.
Cool. Yeah. So sorry, this might have been covered and I might have missed it, but for me, if you've got your back ends, well, one of the advantages of back ends obviously is one calling the API of another. Now I could imagine with micro front ends, you would go off and call for a person, a contact or whatever, and send that person on a front end journey and it comes back with a response to your other front end. Is that sort of structure in place with these micro front ends, or are they all sort of independent pages?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question.
Okay, do you want me to phrase it? I'll try it again. Is there an API for micro front ends where each front end can call each other to send off on journeys somewhere and come back?
Like kind of sharing state between the front ends?
Yeah, states. It's more sort of like the chance to send to communicate with each other, and
yep.
Because each front end carries on its own conversation with the customer, and you want to offload that responsibility.
Yeah, so there's probably quite a few ways to share state. Ideally, try to, with each domain, you minimize the state that you share. The less that you have to communicate, the better. The application shell will provide some communication that everybody needs, for example, the authentication, the cookies, that can be provided. If you need more complicated, sometimes the URL parameters is a good place to have some sort of decent state. But if you need something really complicated, for example, we have a customer chatting, and this chat needs to be shared across a different front end, that's probably something that you push the back end to do state management for that. But yeah, the least that you share between the front ends, the better. That just makes it easier. It's same with microservices. Hopefully that answers your question.
I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to wrap the questions up there. I know. I appreciate the hand. Please do find Evan afterwards or hit him up on LinkedIn for some cool questions. Please, a huge round of applause for Evan. Thank you very much.